Now, our next speakers are Terry Bailey, Graeme Enders and Paul Packard, who will be speaking about the newly formed Snowy Advisory Committee, which replaces the Snowy Scientific Committee. Now, Terry provides advisory services around Australia on environment, heritage and public policy to governments and the private sector, including advising on World Heritage in the West Pilbara of Western Australia, Indigenous access to water in Victoria. He's an Associate Professor at the Fenner School of Environment and Society at ANU, where he teaches and assesses and co-supervises a PhD student at ANU. He was previously the Chief Executive Officer of the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage and the Assistant Secretary for Heritage in the Commonwealth Government, where he oversaw the National Heritage Assessment of the Australian Alps National Park. Terry was first introduced to the Snowy River in the 1980s, rafting, and has lived and worked and skied in the Victorian Alps as well. He lives with his family in the South Coast, and he is the independent chair of the Snowy Advisory Committee. I'll just give Graeme Enders a bit of a talk, because I think you're all going to get up together. One after the other. Okay, well, I won't do your intro then. That's all right.
Just a couple of things as we start. I'd just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet today, pay my respects to elders past, present and future, but I also wanted to acknowledge Aboriginal people joining us today and the traditional owners of the land across which the whole of the Snowy flows, and pay my respects to them as well. I also wanted to thank the Alliance for the invitation today, wish everybody a good morning, and then just let you know what I'll cover in terms of the conversation that I'll have. Graeme and Paul will join, and then we'll have the opportunity for a few questions. But I've been asked to talk about the role, the process for the Snowy Advisory Committee, which is newly appointed. I'll point out who's on the committee, as well as the goals of what we're trying to achieve in the next little while. My apologies for an appalling pun. I'm about to run a pretty dry session between a couple of really interesting ones, but it's really valuable, the opportunity for everybody to get an understanding of what the committee is and how the committee will work. And I won't go into the background because we've heard a fair bit of that this morning already, around how the Snowy Water Inquiry was conducted, and I want to touch on this in particular, this thing called the Snowy Water Inquiry Outcomes Implementation Deed. And that's a really important one for the work of the committee, because the committee is actually structured around the impacts of that deed. It's structured around a statutory basis as well. So those things outline what the committee can and can't do. And this is the difference between what the committee controls, what the committee seeks to influence, and what the committee can be concerned about, but doesn't influence or doesn't control. And I need to separate some of those so everybody's got a good understanding in terms of the role of the committee, and particularly when it comes to accosting committee members around what they can do, in that difference between what we control and what we seek to influence. So we've already heard a bit about that thing that we call the SWIOID, which is the Snowy Water Inquiry Outcomes Implementation Deed. And that commits to environmental water recovery targets that we've heard a bit about this morning. It sets out arrangements for acquiring and managing the environmental flows, and it sets out the arrangements for transferring and arrangements around some of the revoking of Snowy water licences. So it's a complicated deed that's been agreed between governments. It has a legal basis, so it sets a whole set of rules. The other is that the Snowy Hydro Corporatisation Act actually establishes the Snowy Advisory Committee. Okay, so the committee's established under that Act, and while we see the primary role of the committee being a vehicle for community and government discussion, and that's the primary role of what we want to achieve out of the work that the committee does, and using that in terms of the water recovery under the initiative for the environment in both the Snowy and the Snowy Montane rivers. Okay, so it covers both, but the legislated function, and this is part of the really dry part of it, is to advise the Water Administration Ministerial Corporation, for want of a better term, that's actually the Minister for Regional Water, Niall Blair, each year on the timing and pattern for the release of water for environmental reasons under the Snowy Water Licence. So that's actually legally what we're required to do, and when I mention that timing and pattern, the table is on the table that outlines the release and timing of the pattern, and that's some of the work that we'll be doing. As we've also heard, the Snowy Water Licences include the increased Snowy River flow of up to 212 gigalitres per year, and I think that up to has been emphasised on the fact that it's not a guarantee. It includes up to, again, 118 gigalitres for the Snowy Montane rivers for increased flows. And in fact, it also captured the 70 gigalitres per year that's gone to the River Murray. But the Snowy Advisory Committee doesn't have a role in advising on River Murray either. And then when you start to look down into the SWEOID around the roles and what's trying to be achieved from an environmental perspective, the objectives for the increased flow is to improve the habitat of a diverse range of plants and animal species. And that's through a combination of doing things like improving the temperature regime of the river. It's about achieving channel maintenance and flushing flows. And we've just heard on some of the really important reasons for managing those flushing flows well as it relates to siltation that might come from surface flow. It's about restoring connectivity, and particularly as that helps migratory species move through landscapes. It's about improving triggers for fish spawning, and it's about improving the aesthetics. So that's the construct around the Snowy. When you think about the Snowy Montanes, it's slightly different. And the role there of what's trying to be achieved is greater protection of endangered and threatened species, maintenance of the natural habitat, and helping to maintain the wilderness and national park values in the landscape. So in short, when you think about all of that, in short, what's the committee trying to do? It's really trying to influence, because I'm going to touch on the form of advice we have to give, and it's an influencing role, it's not a decision-making role. But the committee's really pulling in some expert and local input to the design of the environmental flows for both the Snowy and the Snowy Montane. And the other that's really important, I think, is to increase the transparency around the decision-making that goes to support those decisions that happen. And that's the really important connection both up and back to the community, and advising the government agencies how that communication occurs, what it looks like, and how it's transparent back. So just again for the committee, the form of the advice of the committee is really about those environmental flow strategies. That's really the primary role. And that's been the work of the Department of Industry Water, has been responsible for preparing those in the past and notifying Snowy Hydro in terms of then doing those release at the obligations around the timing and the volumes to do that. But there's recently been, and for people to be aware, a recent change is that function is moving from DOI Water to the Office of Environment and Heritage. So the environmental flow responsibilities are moving and aim to be moved this year. Now that's actually consistent with the fact that the Office of Environment and Heritage manage environmental waters across the whole of New South Wales. So this really brings that into line. The ministerial responsibilities won't change, but the agency actually undertaking and giving the advice. Now, having said that, what's been incredibly important for me is to make sure that the expertise, knowledge and background of the Department of Industry Water people is retained, and that we'll continue to connect that and be able to pull that through in the discussions, and we will still have attendance at the meetings and in the advisory work we do between the two agencies. It's not being seen as the singular. as I mentioned before, there are some limits to the decision-making power. So it is called an advisory committee for that very reason. And it hasn't been delegated decision-making power. So the final watering action decisions are really worked out between the Office of Environment and Heritage, the Department of Industry, Water, in terms of giving that advice as it sits in under the Minister responsible for regional water. So that's where it sits. We expect to give that advice. We would expect, by and large, for that advice to be followed. But to help increase the transparency, where that advice isn't being followed, we would be seeking an explanation around why that hasn't occurred. And what does that mean? And what does that mean for future advice? And how we feed that back to community to open dialogue that runs in two directions will be really important role over time. It's not the role of the committee to advise on the adequacy of water resource allocation or water recovery volumes. I think as Claire pointed out earlier, if we get back into that, the committee, that's multi-jurisdictional, high-level government decision-making that would need to be taken. So it's not providing advice on that. We're not having advice on that sort, nor do we have a role in giving reporting on the state of the environment. That's a slight difference from the old scientific committee, which did have. But what we will be drawing on is a lot of people who actually give us that advice, because we need to understand the state of the environment to be able to put together coherent advice around what the flows should look like to try and improve environmental outcomes. The other, though, that does sit, even though they're things that we're not, there is the Minister for Regional Water, or OEH, might seek specific advice from the committee in relation to the delivery of the existing environmental waters. And one of the things that's flagged in the background that at some point will be a conversation I expect for the committee will be the pros and cons of delivering environmental flows over the Mwamba Weir. So I think that's one of the things that we will have discussion about and look to give some advice on the pros and cons. I just want to touch on a couple of things now around who else is on the committee. The committees, there are 8 in total members of the committee. 2 community representatives from Victoria. Auntie Doris Patton is a representative from Victoria, as is Robert Graeme. Robert's from Marlow, and I think there was a mention today about water in the Lower Snowy. Robert sent some photos through during the week showing lots of water down and hoping for a peak a little bit about in the next few days to take that water even further in terms of the mouth of the Snowy itself. From New South Wales, Auntie Iris White and Vicky Wallace, and Vicky's here today. Vicky's one of the people I had in mind when I thought I'd better mention very clearly what our role is and isn't, so that the accosting of the local community, because I know it's more complicated for Vicky living and being here full-time, to be able to help the community understand where our role begins, where our role ends, and how we can influence. Another member of the committee here today is Fiona Dyer. Fiona's Senior Research Fellow in the Institute of Applied Ecology and representing environment at on the committees from the University of Canberra. Graeme Deere, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the East Gippsland Catchment Management Authority, and Graeme Enders is also here today. Graeme's the Director in the South West Regional Operations for the Office of Environment and Heritage. Just very quickly, I also wanted to touch on what are we doing now, what will we be doing the next little while. And clearly one of the most important tasks of the committee in the next little while is actually to prepare the advice for the 2019-2020 releases. And we are required to do that and put that advice through by about February to have it in time to be considered. And that's a really, really complicated one, and it'll be complicated because of the low inflows influx sequence that we're seeing at the moment, and how we have to think about what it might look like and what it might look like next year in terms of managing flows. So you're really doing some predictive work about up to 16 months ahead of real time. And that's a complicated thing to do. And therefore, and a good example is October the 20th this week, where the flow level was actually below what people intended because the inflow sequence had been lower than expected. In the longer term, so that's the immediate term role for the committee to be ready. In the longer term, an important task will be to provide strategic advice to government on the Snowy environmental flows, namely the impact and benefit of the environmental flows over time. And for us, that'll be looking back as well as then being able to apply that looking forward. And the words I've used entirely today are environmental because the program is environmental, but one of the other long-term pieces that's absolutely critical and important is looking at not only improving environmental outcomes, but we'll actively seek shared or complementary social, cultural and community benefits. Where they can be met in a complementary fashion with achieving environmental outcomes, we should be. And we should be seeking to do that as much as we possibly can for social, cultural and community right along the river. Just to date, the committee's only had one meeting. We met a couple of weeks ago. That meeting had really a few quite normal and simple aims, as you'd expect, was getting to know other members, setting up how the committee will work, gaining background information to help understand as we go forward. So we had some really good briefings in that sense from Jane Roberts, the former chair of the Snowy Scientific Committee, from Snowy Hydro, the Department of Industry, Water and OEH, all made presentations and gave us some good background information. We had the chance to actually drop down to Jindabyne to have a look at the dam wall, to get an understanding of the operations and a discussion there with Snowy Hydro. We visited Moamba Weir to have a look on site and have a bit of a discussion as we kind of think that is likely to be a major conversation as we go forward. And then we had the chance to come to Dalgety to connect with community and start that conversation in listening with community members. And then in the next little while, the committee will really pull together. We'll meet in November. We'll start to do that planning for the 1920 discussion. We need to prepare that advice by February next year. And then in about April, I think we'll get back together to have a bit of a discussion on how did this thing pull together, recognising it all happened very quickly. But how do we actually learn from it? What are we learning? How do we start to apply that to the following process as we pull it together? So it's kind of taking long-term views. But just in conclusion, very quickly, in terms of the advisory committee, just to remind, it's new, quite literally new, first meeting only last month. We've hit the ground running because we do need to provide that advice within the next few months. We'll be seeking really good communication and transparency. And for me, that's fundamental in all of this, that there's a lot of good communication and transparency, both through the community, through the government agencies and with the committee. And we'll also be looking for that long-term river health question and complementarity with those other social, cultural and community values where we can find them. So that was the bit that I was going to cover.
Thank you, Terry. Graeme Enders is currently the Director of Southwest Regional Operations at New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage, based in Albury, where he is responsible for the New South Wales environmental water operations in the Lachlan, Murrumbidgee, Murray and Lower Darling rivers. Graeme was the Snowy River Recovery Coordinator for New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet from 2002 to 2006, and that's when I first met Graeme, when he helped to get a Snowy River festival going and wanted a schools event, which I coordinated, and that was an initiative of Graeme's. In that role, he coordinated an investment program across agencies and community for the rehabilitation of the Snowy River and renewal of community capacity in preparation for increased Snowy River flows. And Graeme will introduce Paul Packard in a minute.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Hello, everybody, and it's great to be back in Dalgety again. Thanks, Terry. I think Terry's covered most of the scope and work of the committee, so I might cross over a little bit of that in a fairly short talk, really. I also would like to acknowledge Ngarigo elders and of the country that we meet on today, and acknowledge elders past and present and future, and the importance of the river to those. Note the importance of the river to those people, and to the many peoples who came to the mountains every year, and still do. Thanks, Eleanor, for the invitation to come and speak today and to update people, I suppose, on where things have got to with the formation of the Snowy Advisory Committee. So things might happen slowly in government, but they have happened. So we have an advisory committee, and I want to talk about today the partnership that we have with Department of Industry Water. So Jeremy Kinley over here will talk later today as well, but we're working together to support the committee. So I want to zoom out a little bit in a moment and talk about how we're doing that and how we see that going forward. So what could be more important than the river to people here? Because we know that the health of the river affects the health of the community. There's an intrinsic relationship there. And we also know that the health of the river is dependent on the stewardship of the communities that live along it. And so I acknowledge the Snowy River Alliance, the Aboriginal people, the rural communities around here who support the Alliance, who have worked so hard, as Claire outlined earlier on, to achieve environmental flows and health back into the river. And from what I can see, and what we've learned so far, we're going okay. We're on a recovery trajectory for the river. There's a long way to go, and as we heard last year from Teresa Rose, looking at the geomorphology of the river, that could take a very long time indeed, depending on how much water we have and how the river behaves and responds. But you have to say that the initial response has been very encouraging. The river looks good, and it was really helped along, as Leon reminded me earlier today, by that first big flow, as if we got that big helping hand from the sky, from the mountains. We had a massive flow in the river, gave it a big push, and then we've been able to come back in behind that with the water that we've had available. So we're just hoping now that we can work together effectively to keep it going along that trend. So as I say, Department of Industry Water, Office of Environment and Heritage working together to support the committee. So Terry's given you a pretty good insight there into how the committee operates and what it'll be doing, but how we're going to make that work. So Department of Industry Water are responsible for the Snowy Water Licence, for regulating that and that relationship with Snowy Hydro. And that happens through the setting of an annual water operating plan. Very exciting stuff. But in fact, that's the document, or the instruction, if you like, that carries the requirement to Snowy Hydro about what's been set for the coming year in terms of water releases to the Snowy and to the Montane. And as we've heard from a few speakers this morning, it's not a fixed amount of water that we're talking about. We're talking about a set of water licences that again are administered by Department of Industry Water. Allocations accrue to those licences, and as Claire reminded us, those allocations this year, very low inflows, are looking pretty poor. So you get the high securities looking okay, and the 90%, 0 in the Murray, 7 in the Murrumbidgee at the moment. So as we stand here today, we're thinking we're not going to have a lot of water to use to allocate to meet some of the objectives for next year. So we'll see how we go. Forecast rain today, fingers crossed. Might bring a bit of snow down and bump things up a bit. So that's Department of Industry Water, managing that side of things under the Minister's delegation and responsibilities. OEH, and as Terry introduced us, the Office of Environment and Heritage is responsible for environmental water management across New South Wales. So what we're bringing here is the experience that we've built up in other river systems, and across the Murray-Darling Basin in New South Wales, the Border and Gwydir rivers, the Macquarie River, the Lachlan River, the Murrumbidgee River, the Murray River and the Lower Darling all have environmental allocations or rules that we are responsible for, where there's discretion and decisions to be made, organising those decisions and getting that water into, similarly, an annual flow regime that'll meet its targets. Now, under the Basin Plan, the machinery has changed a little bit now that we're required to prepare long-term water plans for each of those river valleys. So we're currently doing that, and that really provides a good template for some more experience that we can bring to the Snowy. We can capture all of the objectives and recovery trends and things we've talked about that we want to achieve for the Murray for the Snowy, I beg your pardon, into a long-term water plan, and then each year we can give effect to that by the annual flow release. That'll be very similar to what's happening across the rest of water world. People will understand it, we'll be able to communicate it in a very similar way, and it'll make the communication about what we're on about here and what we're hoping to achieve a whole lot easier, I would expect. So the process, as Terry outlined, working back from the 1st of May every year with the commencement of the Snowy Water Year, by that time the annual water operating plan has to be agreed, which brings us back to February really for our opportunity to provide the final settling of the advice for an annual flow regime for Snowy and Montane rivers for Department of Industry then to go and finalise that with Snowy Hydro. Coming back, that brings us back to sort of before Christmas, so now-ish, to get together and work out how much water it looks like we're going to have in the bucket, because we're really talking about the winter-spring inflows that accrue to those licences, how we might allocate them in the coming year, what are the key environmental objectives that we have to align them to, do we need a flushing flow this year or not, have we got enough water to do it, that kind of thing. What sort of flow pattern do we want to advise should be appropriate for the year ahead. And as Terry said, there's a time lag, quite a considerable time lag, so it sometimes gets a bit nonsensical if you're in a decreasing rainfall trend or an increasing rainfall trend across seasons to be taking the water from the year before to the advice from this year into the flow for the next year. So there's a bit of a lag there that sometimes you'll scratch your heads and think what's going on here, but that's why, just that machinery of bringing that the available water through to actual releases. Just another little comment on that variability of water availability. So this year we saw a new and interesting thing, that Snowy Hydro was preparing to build up the dam for a flushing flow this year. We had water to do the flushing flow, but the inflows just dropped right away. There just wasn't water coming into the system. They found it difficult to build the dam up, and it looked very likely a month or two ago that we wouldn't be able to do that to get the river up to put it over the spillway. The dam up to put it over the spillway. That's in fact what happened. Couldn't do it. So that water had to be delivered by the cone valves. So you still get the water, but probably just don't get the peak energy out of the flow that was intended. And that's something we'll have to consider now, as if we didn't get that energy and that bit of work done in the river, what does that mean for the next time that we plan to do that? So I guess we see a part of our role too is to assist with that clear information framework, that communication that sits around the committee. And that's the community, to landholders, to community groups, and importantly also to river users and to canoeists and recreation, the growing tourism industry. It's important that people know when flows are going to happen. So at the moment, they're published a year in advance, and that sort of locked in kind of forward projection is always going to be there in terms of what the flows are going to be like. But we're kind of hearing people that if you're a landholder living on the river, you need to know whether or not you can get across. So you need that fine scale information. If you're running a canoeing business, you'd really like that water delivered on a weekend or on a public holiday. There's some practical realities to whether or not that can be done. That affects Snowy Hydro in terms of their management, staffing and operations. But within the scope of, are we still achieving the environmental objectives we're set out to achieve? We'd like to look at that and say, have we got flexibility to do this? And if we can, then have a look at it, knowing that we've also got to advise people if there's been a change. Now, the forward flows are set. The annual amount of water available is fixed and monthly targets are fixed. It's likely that there'll be some flexibility within that. But we'll work with DOI Water, with Snowy Hydro and the committee to work out just what tolerances there and what flexibility is possible. So I guess that's really the story. Our job is to support the advisory committee, pick up its advice, synthesise that with what other information we have about what we're trying to achieve for the river, provide that to Department of Industry Water, hear through them to Snowy Hydro, have direct conversations with Snowy Hydro about how we can do that better or improve it or more flexibly, and deliver the flows. Then most importantly, monitor and report on those. And we're very keen to make sure that we achieve continuity from the people who've been working on the Snowy up to date, that we bring forward all of that knowledge and information from benchmarking and flow response monitoring to the work's been done in the last couple of years by Department of Industry people, and make sure that that's available to the committee, and that we get our head on about what it is that we need to measure in the future to just be able to do that litmus test and say, is this river still recovering in the way that we expected it would? So that's Office of Environment and Heritage, that's us. I'll just introduce Paul Packard. Paul, if you'd like to come up. So Paul's your new river manager, if you like, for Office of Environment and Heritage. And that's just an extra hat because Paul looks after the Lachlan River as well. So he's got quite a different river system to look at in the Lachlan to the Snowy, but the basic framework there would be the same. Paul's an archaeologist and has worked for many in his training, but has worked for many years in biodiversity and river management and quite a few years in the Lachlan there. Lives up in Canberra. He's very familiar with this area, and I think is quite excited to get involved with the Snowy, but maybe just a bit of a challenge really on top of what else you're doing. So Paul, chance for you to introduce yourself too.
Yeah. Thanks, Graeme. I get to be the difficult position of being the last one to speak, so I find that Terry's already said most of what I would have said, and Graeme's just finished it off. So I'll just give a very brief view of update on how the committee might work. You know, we're thinking of running about 3 to 4 meetings a year. They'll be mostly in the Jindabyne region, but we're also looking at trying to run them elsewhere to get to meet other parts of the community and other issues. Usually over a couple of days at the most. And obviously, as Terry and Graeme have alluded, there's the issues of we need certain timings of advice. So there'll be a mad rush coming up towards that sort of February date. And so there'll be the meetings won't be evenly spread across the year. There will be some degree of compression there. Just to reiterate also, I think Terry touched on it, that the committee provides advice on the Snowy River increased flows and the Montane River increased flows that go out of Tantangara and the upper creeks, but we don't provide advice on the Murray River increased flows. So there is some attention placed outside of the Snowy as well. I think the committee will be different than the committees we run elsewhere in other valleys, but will have some similarities. The membership, the sorts of issues they have to deal with, the information that has to come in, but it's very much about trying to connect in with community and connect in with the issues in the landscape. And so I look forward to, organising meetings and or field trips in these sorts of areas, getting to meet communities elsewhere and broadening that input of advice and perspectives.
Just a footnote, there's been a bit of discussion this morning about River Murray increased flows, so I might just explain our role on the other side of the hill. So the River Murray increased flows are part of the volumes of environmental water that are considered by a consortium group, if you like, of agencies. So there's the Victorian Environmental Water Holder, the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, ourselves as representing New South Wales Water Holding, Department of Industry, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, all get around the table and coordinate the delivery of environmental water on the Murray side, because initially there was a Living Murray program, and since then there's been water recovery under other programs, plus the 70 GLs from Water for Rivers that has to be made good use of in the Murray system. So there's a similar kind of advisory process that goes on over there. We have a Murray Lower Darling water advisory group, similar to the Snowy Advisory Committee, follow the same sort of process. But in the end, the agencies who hold the water, or the government organisations or whatever, hold the water, come together and agree on how to coordinate the delivery of that water each year. And so the River Murray increased flows that were called out or were pushed out of the system over the last few years, we have been delivering those this year. There were cod flows that were run through the Murray, through the Barmer Mellower in the winter to attract cod attractant flows, we call them, attract cod up into the forests, into all of those little creeks, get them ready to breed in spring, and that seems to be working quite well. And some of that water is still available for us to manage other outcomes through the year.